Hello, welcome to the presentation, The Administrator's Role in the Referral of Deaf-Blind Children, Equitable Access to Education. My name is Emma Nelson, and I'm the Initiative Lead for Identification and Referral at the National Center on Deaf-Blindness. Next slide, please. The contents of this presentation were developed by the presenters for the 2022 OSEP conference. However, these contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. Next slide, please. Today, I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues, Tanni Anthony from the Colorado Services for Children and Youth with Combined Vision and Hearing Loss Project, and Deb Ziegler, who is a consultant with the National Center on Deaf-Blindness. Next slide, please. Today's objectives are that participants will increase their knowledge of policy and practice issues of proper referral of children with deaf-blindness to state deaf-blind projects, and increase their knowledge of evidence-based strategies administrators can use to lead their teams through the process of referral of children with deaf-blindness to state deaf-blind projects. Next slide. The core dilemma we're going to address today is around the challenges associated with identification and referral of children who are deaf-blind. Mainly, that children and youth are not properly identified as deaf-blind, and consequently are not referred to state deaf-blind projects. Also, when children are not identified as deaf-blind, they often do not receive equitable access to educational services and supports. And this lack of equitable access limits their ability to have meaningful peer engagement, to participate in school learning activities, and achieve high-level outcomes. Next slide, please. So what are the main referral challenges we're addressing today? Primarily, we're going to be addressing the lack of knowledge of the National Deaf-Blind Child Count, the discrepancy in the IDEA Part B child count and the National Deaf-Blind Child Count numbers, and the challenge that without the identification of a child with combined vision and hearing loss as deaf-blind and consequent referral to appropriate services, including the state deaf-blind projects, necessary supports for children and youth who are deaf-blind and their families will not be provided. Next slide, please. As a National Technical Assistance and Information Center, NCDB is part of and collaborates with a network of projects that help those who support children and youth with deaf-blindness. Our key focus is to assist state deaf-blind projects in all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, the Pacific Basin, and the Virgin Islands. We support their efforts to provide a range of services, from child-specific assistance to system-wide efforts to create or improve state and local services. We also maintain the National Deaf-Blind Child Count. It is authorized by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, and state data is compiled and reported annually in the National Deaf-Blind Child Count Report. The first report was published in 1986. Next slide, please. Today in the US, there are around 10,000 children, birth to 21, who have been identified as deaf-blind. There is a wide spectrum of losses in both hearing and vision, and no two children are alike. Variations occur in causes, age of onset, levels of sensory loss, and additional disabilities. Because it is so individualized, services and supports must be designed to meet each child's unique needs and abilities. Next slide, please. The early years are critical, especially in the areas of social, emotional, and communication development. Early intervention services can help families and service providers understand the child's sensory impairment and learn how they can support the child's growth and development. Next slide, please. This graphic gives perspective of the low incidence nature of this population. The large blue circle represents the US population in 2019. The small yellow circle represents the special education population in that same year. And the tiny red dot, which has been enlarged because it's so small you can barely see it, represents the deafblind population. This highlights the importance of partnerships. Although it looks small on this graph and on caseloads, it is the whole world to the family who has a child with deafblindness. Diversity and equity means serving all children, and meeting the needs of this low incidence population is critically important. Next slide, please. Early identification and referral to appropriate services can make a tremendous difference for a child with dual sensory loss. A team approach, including family professional partnerships, are essential for promoting optimal outcomes. Connecting families together to learn from one another and receive encouragement is vital. Sibling support programs are also often highly beneficial as well. As a low incidence population, it is critically important to connect families with the latest research and researchers with the latest information regarding the population in order to improve the quality of care and outcomes. And of course, national and state data is crucial for informing changes to federal and state legislation or new legislation. Next slide, please. Here is a quick comparison of the two data collections and the discrepancies between them. On the left side is the IDEA Part B child count, and on the right is the National Deafblind Child Count. There are several differences I want to draw your attention to. First, the IDEA Part B child count collects data on children served under IDEA with disabilities, whereas the National Deafblind Child Count collects only data on children with deafblindness. Secondly, the people who collect the data are different. The U.S. Department of Education collects and manages the Part B child count, whereas the National Center on Deafblind collects and manages the National Deafblind Child Count. The sources of the data for the data collections are also different. State educational agencies, or SEAs, collect and report the data for the IDEA Part B child count, whereas the data for National Deafblind Child Count is reported by state and multi-state deafblind projects. Finally, the children reported under the category of deafblindness is different. We'll go into this more in depth in the next few slides, but the IDEA Part B child count only categorizes children as having deafblindness if they have deafblindness, do not have a developmental delay, and if their deafblindness is not combined with another disability category. In comparison, the National Deafblind Child Count reports children with deafblindness, regardless of any other disability they may have, or the severity of hearing and vision loss. Next slide, please. Let's look at how the IDEA child count figures for deafblindness compared to the National Deafblind Child Count figures. The top bar shows the IDEA child count figure of about 2,000 children that we saw on the previous slide. Below that, we see the deafblind child count figure for the same year, which is nearly 10,000 children. That's 5.7 times as many children. Next slide, please. Finally, here is a chart of some of the data that's taken from that annual National Deafblind Child Count report. This data shows responses by the state and multi-state deafblind projects to the question of which category children with deafblindness were reported under the IDEA Part B child count. At the top of the list is multiple disabilities, with 3,954 children. Second most common, with about half as many children, is deafblindness. However, you can see that children with deafblindness are reported under all the different disability categories under IDEA. As I've said, this is an extremely low incidence population, but if the dual sensory loss is not recognized, the implications are huge. The deafblind projects can assist with identification and programming efforts. And now I will turn it over to Tanni Anthony to share some specific examples of how state deafblind projects can support these efforts.
Thanks, Emma. I'm happy to talk about the deafblind projects because I've been involved with the Colorado project for many decades, actually. It's a very exciting opportunity when we look at what's happening with the support from OSEP and the U.S. Department of Education. A focus should always be to understand that this is free technical assistance in all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, the Pacific Basin, and the Virgin Islands. So these projects have been in place for well over 30 years. And depending on where they are in your state, you may see opportunities with universities, with state departments of education, with nonprofits, et cetera. So it's a very exciting opportunity for special education directors and other administrators to learn. The focus of the project is to work very closely with early intervention and school-based teams to address the needs of children and youth who are deaf-blind from birth to 21. Also, the projects work very closely with families, and a goal is to really facilitate family involvement, connection, and leadership. We also are very involved with our OPSEP-funded parent training and information centers. Part of the project's job is to always look at identification. And Emma talks so great about the importance of early identification. We start as early as possible. Sometimes we are finding babies as early as 3 months, but we also may find kids later on who have progressive hearing and vision loss that might pop up in the school years. So we're always looking at identification across all these age bands. Part of the job is to always promote access to and progress in the general education curriculum and grade level academic content standards. We work very closely with the sensory specialists hired both in early intervention and school-based programs. So that could include an audiologist, a teacher of the deaf, a teacher of students with visual impairments, an orientation mobility specialist. Could also be your specialist who work with children with severe disabilities. Our goal is to find anyone in the school district who can identify and support the education of the children. The projects also provide statewide and customized professional development on deaf-blindness. You may see a team of experts from the deaf-blind projects come out to an individual school district to tailor a training specific to a child. They also may offer a summer institute and invite personnel from across the state just to learn more about identification efforts, communication programs, specialized accessibility techniques, et cetera. And finally, just like Emma talked about, each of the deafblind projects contributes state data to the annual and national deafblind child count. I will speak personally how exciting this is for a project. In my own state, we have about 165 learners that we've identified birth through 21. If you take out the infants and toddlers, it would reduce it a little bit, maybe by about 17. But in our December 1 count, we identify between 12 and 13 kids nationally, or excuse me, statewide. So that just gives you, again, a little bit of understanding about why it's so important to work with exclusive identification across those disability categories. So as I mentioned, each state sort of has different flavor depending on where we're located and what resources in our state, we may be involved with different projects. So one of the projects that I've been asked to highlight in Colorado is a course that's longstanding through the University of Northern Colorado. It is a 3-semester graduate course. It involves 7 modules. The name of the course is an advanced seminar for students with hearing or visual disabilities. It includes content specific to students who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired, and deaf-blind. It's been my privilege to be one of the instructors of the course, and it is a requirement for all of our special education directors in training. And you can link to the syllabus, and I would encourage you to do so. As I mentioned, there are 7 modules, and we cover a lot of content. And at the end of the course, what I always hear from special education directors is that this might be the first time that they've had specific training about students with sensory disability, and very specifically with students with deaf-blindness. And it energizes the directors because they go into their jobs really understanding just what Emma talked about, that while it's a small population of children, it's highly heterogeneous with kids who, when people have specific training, can ensure accessibility throughout the day. So I would encourage you to spend a little time looking at that syllabus just to see some of the content that's covered. It's a 3-semester course, and quite honestly, I always catch my breath at the end of the course because there's even more to teach. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your time, and next slides will be another presenter.
Thank you, Tanni. That course sounds fabulous. I'm looking forward to digging in and looking at the resources through the syllabus. So I'm going to take a few minutes and share with you another initiative that supports administrators. And the National Center on Deaf-Blindness developed a brief entitled The Identification and Referral of School-Aged Children and Youth with Deaf-Blindness, Resources for School Administrators. We're in our final stages of having this brief available, and we hope to launch it in the summer of 2022. So you'll have an opportunity to take a look at it at that point. This brief addresses the strategies and resources for administrators to support identification and referral of children and youth with deaf-blindness. And I'll just take a few minutes to offer you a quick glimpse at the components of the brief. Next. So this is developed primarily for state and local administrators, both special education and general education. So those professionals on teams at the local and the state level would benefit by having access to this brief. And we want to reach those administrators primarily through a variety of avenues for dissemination, but primarily we want to address professional associations and organizations that administrators belong to. So those groups of special education administrators at a local level, as well as an SEA, might be part of those professional associations, like NASD, like the Council for Exceptional Children, the CASE division, elementary and secondary principals. They are leading the teams in the schoolhouses around identification and referral. So we want to be as inclusive as possible. We hope that we'll be able to collaborate with organizations and associations around professional development events, including conference presentations, newsletters, journals, websites, etc. So getting out information in a variety of ways that will make it easy for administrators to access these resources. Next. Part of the brief is looking at increasing the knowledge and skill of administrators, and this particular component is primarily addressed towards those that are general educators that may not have a grounding as special educators and may need a little bit more of information with regard to the identification process and how it relates and aligns with the identification of those children with deaf-blindness. So some of the key components that we've included in this brief of the identification process includes child find, and we want to make sure that the health community is very much involved with those child find activities, and so some collaboration between the school administrators and the health community. Looking at evaluation and having those professionals with the expertise in vision, hearing, and deaf-blindness will be, of course, very important. And if a school district or a local school doesn't have those professionals, we know that we can turn to the state deaf-blind projects, as Tanni had shared with us a few minutes ago. Also looking at eligibility and how we really focus in on the eligibility criteria and requirements for those children who may be deaf-blind. And then finally, data reporting, looking at that primary disability category of deaf-blindness, not ignoring secondary disability categories, but also focusing in on exactly what is the primary disability category for this particular child. And if they present themselves as a child who is deaf-blind, then perhaps deaf-blindness may be the category where they should be reported. Next. So what can administrators do to move this agenda forward, we want to make sure that we have key personnel who are trained and have experience in deaf-blindness. We know this is a low incidence disability. We also know that we don't have as many trained and experienced professionals in the field. And hopefully the course that Tanni talked to us about will enable more administrators to have a better sense of what those key requirements are. We want to make sure that administrators are collaborating across agencies, including education, health, and social services, that they have a full team when they're identifying children and referring them to the most appropriate services and supports. We want to make sure there are no fiscal incentives to report the number of children who are deaf-blind in categories other than deaf-blindness. And we want to, of course, include families in a collaborative way and to ensure they understand the importance and benefits of referring their child to the state deaf-blind project. And in order to do that, administrators also need to know and understand what those benefits are and why it's so important that children are referred to the state deaf-blind project. Next. In addition, working collaboratively with families in helping them understand and know about family organizations in their community, in their local community, in the state and nationally. And these can be those family organizations that focus on children with deaf-blindness or on other family organizations that have resources for all children who have disabilities. And these are certainly resources that will be very valuable for families to access. I want to make sure that there is participation in the annual deaf-blind child count. And advocacy is an important part of the work that we do collectively. And it would behoove us to advocate for improved policies at the local, state, and federal level regarding identification, referral, and data collection. We know that there are changes that could be made that would benefit the end outcome of identification and referral, and hopefully provide more appropriate services and supports to children who are deaf-blind. And then finally, accessing the resources on the National Center on Deaf-Blindness and the State Deaf-Blind Project websites. Next. So what are next steps for you as you leave this session and choose another session with the OSEP Leadership Conference? So we're going to leave you with a couple of questions and a path that maybe you will want to go down once you get back into your work after this conference. So let's look at what collaborative relationships could be nourished to improve identification and referral in your state. What types of data would be helpful to inform potential strategies to improve identification and referral in your state? And what other activities can be pursued to improve identification and referral in your state? What do you need from the Deaf-Blind TA network to move forward in your state work? Next, please. And then finally, read and disseminate to administrators in your state the National Center on Deaf-Blindness brief, identification and referral of school-age children and youth with deaf-blindness, resources for school administrators. Let us know how we can help you, what resources you will need, and how you might want to be involved as we move these many initiatives forward in order to provide the best services and supports and a free, appropriate public education for those children who are deaf-blind. Next. On this slide, you'll see a variety of resources. We've talked about many of them in the last few minutes together, so please access them. I think you'll find the 2019 National Deaf-Blind Child Count Report to be quite interesting and really helps to illuminate the work that we hope to move forward and the reasons why we're moving this work forward. Next. So thank you for listening. On behalf of Tanni, Emma, Tanni, Emma, and myself, Deb Ziegler, happy that you were here with us, and wish you well as you move forward in this work collectively.